So while I was doing some study recently, I came across the idea that we're going to run through in this particular time period, and that is the idea of great expectations. And it's the idea that as you go through and you read Christ's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, as we are known to call it, when he goes through and he is teaching, he is telling us what he expects of his people. He is telling us how he expects his people to act. And so we're going to go through and we're going to pick up at verse 13, which is right after the section on what they call the Beatitudes. But we're going to pick up at verse 13, and we'll be looking at the context of verses 13 through 48. And I will tell you that as we go through this particular lesson, that I will have slides that will have different sections of these passages written out on the slide. And so if you are to go through and to study this on your own, you can certainly stop at these slides and take the time to read them yourself. For time's sake, I am not going to read those passages to you. I am going to encourage you to spend a little bit of time doing that on your own. So as we begin, the first thing that is expected of Christ's followers is that they are to be an example. And that is to say that they are not just to be an example, but they are to be a positive example. And in verses 13 through 16, we have the idea of salt and light. In verse 13, we're taught that Christians are the salt of the earth. And so in order to fully appreciate what it is that he is trying to display to, or to get his listeners to understand, and what it is he wants us to understand today, we need to take just a moment to look at what it is that salt does. And the first thing that salt is known for is that it was used in that time and can be used to stop decay. And so really the idea is, if we are the salt of the earth and we are to stop decay, that tells us that the world at this point is in moral decay, and it is expected of Christ's followers, that is Christians today, to keep it from going bad. Christians are expected to prevent this world from continuing in its decay. Salt also serves as a cleansing agent. And as Christians, we act as salt by living pure lives in this world. Salt is an antiseptic which cleans wounds and it fights infection. So it's something that is used to help the spread of disease and infection, and it is used to heal. One of the things that you can be sure of, if you have ever done this to yourself, or if you've seen it done, or it's happened to someone that you know, is that getting salt into an open wound, while it can fight infection, it certainly also can be painful. And really, the idea here that we can look at is that it certainly hurts the world's conscience when they see how a Christian is living their life, and it causes them to kind of think about what it is that they're doing, and it causes them to think about that the life they're living, and it begins to hurt them in their conscience as they begin to recognize that the life that they're living really isn't the type of life that should be lived. We also understand that one of the characteristics of salt is that it acts as a preservative. And Christians, as salt of the earth, act as a preserving influence when we stand up for what is right and godly. So it's this idea that when we preserve those things which are good, and we cannot do that, we cannot stop the world from going bad if we simply go along with the crowd. We cannot stop it if we don't stand up for what is right, but we continue to act in the way that the world does. And the last thing that we'll look at is the idea that salt adds flavor, or it's the idea that we could say it makes food more attractive. It creates a greater desire in someone to want to eat food if it's added to food when it adds flavor, because it gives something a little bit more. So it is an attractive feature. As salt of the earth, we will attract people to the Word of God by how we live. Just like it can hurt the conscience of those who view how we act and get them to think about how they're acting, other people will look at Christians and they'll see the life that they are living, and they'll want to know what it is that causes them to act in that manner. Something about the way a Christian carries him or herself is attractive to people, and they want to be able to live a life like that. And so they'll ask about that, and that's the responsibility of Christians. We are to be an active and positive influence to the world around us. And then we go on and we have the example of being a light of the world. And again, if we're going to use this idea of darkness and that Christians are to be the light of the world, then we have to recognize that the idea is that this world is in darkness. It's sitting in the darkness of sin, of ignorance, and rebellion. And so it needs light to bring that to the world's attention, to remove that ignorance and to cause those who are rebelling to recognize and change. And so one of the attributes that we would use for speaking of light is that light shines. And we understand that. What it does is light causes something to stand out. And we, as Christians, should stand out and look different than others in the world. And so there should be something that looks different about us, something that can be seen that causes us to stand out and to be different. Light illuminates, and we can say that light will illuminate a path. And when I thought about this, and when I thought about this idea of illuminating a path, it kind of made me think of when you're on an airplane and you're getting ready to take off, and one of the things that they mention is that in the event of an emergency, a path of lights will illuminate, showing you how to get out of the plane. It will illuminate and guide you to where you need to go. As lights of the world, Christians are making the world aware of the path to God and making others aware of who Jesus is and exactly what he has done. What we recognize he has done for us individually, and what they need to recognize he has done for them as well, and the rewards that they can receive if they respond in the proper manner to what it is that he has done for them. And light is a revealing factor, and Christians are to show by word and deed the life God wants all man to live. And so it's the idea that it's revealed to them how they should live. They can finally see by looking at, again, the actions and the lifestyle of a Christian, and they recognize what it is that God desires. And when a Christian allows his light to shine, the scriptures, the verses tell us in verses 13 through 16, we're told that others will see the good deeds because they've been illuminated. The good deeds will be revealed. And ultimately, what happens is God is glorified, which again is the responsibility of his people. Our purpose is to live a life that glorifies God. The second great expectation that Christ talks to us about in our text is his expectation of obedience and the importance of our obedience as it relates to him and his will and his Father's will. And again, this is in verses 17 through 20. You can see that we have on the slide here a printed version of those particular verses. For time's sake, again, we're not going to read those right now, but I encourage you to go back and to look at those. And what I want you to kind of focus on is this idea that also is taught in Luke 11:28. We're told, blessed are those who hear the word of God and obey it. And so there's an expectation that takes place. And we read, according to verse 19 in our text here, that greatness follows obedience to God's law. And so whoever does and teaches God's will shall be great in the kingdom of heaven. On the other hand, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments or teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And so we have this idea that greatness will follow our obedience to God's law, and it will be seen in how we act. And the idea is not only what we do, but also what we teach. And so as I look at this idea, it says whoever does and teaches. To me, that means there's a responsibility to do both of those things. We're expected to do this ourselves, but part of our obedience to God is to teach others to do the same. On the other hand, if we are teaching others or causing others to break his commandments, to disobey him, then we will be considered least in the kingdom of heaven. And we understand that Jesus fulfilled the law, and he talks about that he came to fulfill the law so that we can faithfully obey the commands of the Father. Jesus came to do that. Jesus did come to fulfill the law. He has done so, and we are expected, with great expectation on Christians, to be obedient to that law. In verses 21 through 26, we have the idea of gentleness, or the idea of how we should respond. Really, what he's dealing with is how we should respond when people may be mistreating us, or when there may be differences of opinion, or there may be grievances between ourselves and others. This again would be in section or verses 21 through 26. And Paul, in his letter to the Philippians in the 4th chapter, talks about the idea of let your gentleness be evident to all. So Paul understood the great expectations that Christ has on Christians, and so he lets them know that your gentleness needs to be evident. How you react, how you display that needs to be evident to all. And so as we go through and we highlight what the passage is talking about here, it says, whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of judgment. And so we need to respond with a gentle spirit. When we feel like we've been wronged, and it may or may not be with or without cause, we need to respond with a gentle spirit. It says, whoever says raka shall be in danger of the council, and whoever says you fool shall be in danger of hellfire. And again, this is a very, it's a response in anger. It's a response that doesn't show a gentle and calm spirit, but it shows really an irrational and a spirit of one who is quick to jump to conclusions and to be rough rather than gentle in spirit. And then he talks about the idea that if you do recognize that there is a grievance that a brother has against you, before you go and place your gift at the altar, before you go and try to sacrifice to God and to honor Him, go back and be reconciled with your brother, and do so in a spirit of gentleness. Not go and try to fight and argue, but come together in a spirit of gentleness and be reconciled to one another. And then when you've accomplished that, then you can come back and you can offer your gift. In verses 27 through 30, Jesus speaks to his expectations on the idea of purity. And the emphasis really here is on the idea of, or within the text, it is the idea of being pure from a sexual standpoint. But I think there's even more that we can find in the idea of living a pure and a clean life. Again, we have the context and we have the teaching in verses 27 through 30. And I found this statement and I thought it was interesting. The idea that if you have everything and you do not have purity, you actually have nothing. And so as we consider and we listen to what Christ has to say about purity, he tells us, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. That sounds pretty harsh. But he says, if your eye causes you to sin, get rid of it. Or if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. Again, this idea of it seems rather extreme. But the idea behind this is it is better for you to go through your life minus an eye or minus a hand or partially maimed than to be led to the gates of hell because of your lifestyle. And he's really saying, beware of what you allow your eyes to see and beware of what you allow your hands to touch. If you want to remain pure, keep your eyes focused on what they should be focused on and don't look where you shouldn't look, and keep your hands where your hands need to be and don't touch those things that your hands ought not touch. It's really pretty simple. But there is an expectation of remaining pure, of remaining clean. You hear the idea of pure as the undriven snow, the idea of how white, how clean it is. That's the idea of purity and keeping your body and your soul clean. In verses 31 and 32, he goes on, and I'll read this because we don't have anything following it. But in verses 31 and 32, he kind of carries it also into the idea of marriage being sacred. And he says, furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. So we have this situation where if a wife is being put away for anything other than sexual immorality, then he is causing her to commit adultery. He says, but I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except this impure act, he will cause her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. And so there's this idea of the purity of marriage and the need to keep it pure and keep it clean. As we move forward in our text, there is the idea of the great expectation that Jesus has upon his children, upon Christians, upon God's children, to be truthful, to be honest. And so he goes and he talks about the idea of swearing falsely and performing oaths to the Lord. And he corrects once again. You've heard it said one way, but I say this. And again, the text is there. We're not going to read that. We're going to look at a couple of points from that. Proverbs 11, verse 3 reminds us, or says that the integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity. So the integrity, one who has integrity is one who is known to be truthful, is one who is known to be honest, is one who is known to be someone that you can trust. He simply says that we need to let our yes be yes and our no be no. We should not embellish our conversation with promises that are supposed to strengthen our words. We shouldn't need to add to anything that we have to say in false promise that makes it sound like something stronger than what it is. We need to simply let our words be our words. Let our yes be yes, let our no be no. We need to have enough integrity that people will simply believe what we say. If we live a life where people recognize us of being truthful and honest, and they see us as a person of integrity, then they won't have to have a need for hearing some kind of embellishment to further convince them of our honesty. It is the idea of saying what you mean and meaning what you say. And so there is a great expectation that Christians are to be truthful in how they deal with their fellow man. In verses 38 through 42, and I have to say, kind of figuring out the word that I wanted to use to categorize for this sermon, and it's something that you can come up with one on your own. But for this particular section in 38 through 42, it has to do with the idea of an expectation of being peaceful, keeping peace. It has to do also with the idea of being willing to assist others and go above and beyond what it is that they would ask. It's kind of the idea of allowing yourself to suffer so that others don't have to. And that's really a great way to look at it, is that maybe the expectation is, as Christians, we should be willing to allow ourselves to suffer in order to prevent someone else from that same problem, or to prevent them from suffering. Again, it's in verses 38 through 42. And the idea is, as you can see, I like the little picture here, that we are to repay no one evil for evil. And so he tells us, whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now, I would think that our natural reaction is, whoever slaps us on the right cheek, we in turn want to slap them on the right or the left cheek. That's not what is expected of Christ's followers. If someone is to slap us, then we are to turn the other cheek to them as well. If someone wants to sue and take your tunic, then let him have your cloak also. If someone is trying to take away a part of your clothing, again, go ahead, and the idea is give them more. If it's so important that they need your tunic, then maybe you need to allow yourself to suffer just a little bit and go without a cloak as well, so that they can have both. And then there's the idea of whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And just as a side note, for those that may not have studied or may not be aware, during this particular time, one of the rights that Romans had was to, well, I'm not even going to go into it. We will just put that aside and just take this idea that if someone wants you to go or compels you to do something for a mile, be willing to go beyond that, a 2nd mile, as it says. And it says, give to those who ask, and do not turn away from one who wants to borrow. The idea is to remain at peace when someone looks to harm us, The idea is to assist them in any way that we can. And the idea is to go as far as to even be willing to suffer ourselves in order that they may not suffer. That's a great expectation. That's something, though, that Christ expects out of his followers, and that's what he teaches. And then in verses 43 through 48, we have the idea of his expectations as it comes to love. I will go ahead and read this one because I would like to emphasize a little bit of this, but picking up at verse 43, and once again it starts out, "You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends the rain on the just and on the unjust." I want you to think about that for a moment, and as you look at verse 44 again, "I say to you, love your enemy, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." How many of us, when we hear that, that's the reaction that we would have to those particular situations? That we would show love, that we would pray for someone, that we would do good for those who've treated us in a hateful manner. That's a tough thing to do, but that's a sign of love. That is a sign of being a follower of Christ, and there is a great expectation that we do that. Continuing on in verse 46, he says, "If you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." So if you only treat those who treat you well, if you only treat well those people who treat you well, what have you really done? Don't even the tax collectors, he's saying, the people that you look down upon, don't even the sinners do the same thing? And if you only greet your brethren, what are you doing more than others? If your greeting is only to your brethren and not to everyone, do not even the tax collectors do so? There is a great expectation that love is to go beyond just what the average individual understands. It is to go beyond just loving those who love you. The idea is loving your enemies with no exception. And it's not a suggestion. And none of these things that we're looking at as we go through and he talks about and he gives us his great expectations, these are not just suggestions. These are expectations. These are commands. These are things that we must learn to do. The idea of bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. That's something that you must learn to do. And I will use the term learn because it's not something that tends to come naturally for us. Our general response would be to return evil for evil. That's not love. That's not the love of Christ, and that's not the love of his people. And that's not the love that Christ expects us to have as his people. And he says, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? There's nothing great about the love that you're showing if you do these things. And so that is actually where he closes out, or where we come to the close of the 5th chapter of Matthew. It ends at verse 48. It ends after he has gone through some of these great expectations. There are more expectations, and we could look at more expectations starting in chapter 6 that talk about expectations regarding charitable deeds, expectations regarding various things when you pray. I mean, he goes in through the point is that Christ has great expectations. And these are not expectations that any preacher is laying out for you. These are not expectations that just any elder is laying out for you. These are the expectations that Jesus Christ himself has set forth for his followers to obey and to do. And so what I hope you understand is that being a child of God comes with great expectations. Being a follower of Jesus Christ comes with great expectations, and we all need to take a moment and ask ourselves, how am I doing? And with that, we will close out this particular section of study. I certainly encourage you, go back through, read through Matthew the 5th chapter, look at the idea of these expectations, see how you would write them down if you were to write them down on your own. How would you have worded what these expectations are? And I would encourage you to look forward to, in chapter 6, some of the expectations that he has for you. And write down what it is the expectation is that you find. And then I encourage you to ask yourself, how am I doing? And depending on the answer, you can either keep doing what you are doing, or if you're not doing what it is, or you're not doing as well as you'd like, you can certainly ask your Heavenly Father to help you to do so and continue to work on it. Appreciate your time. Thank you.